Ready? Mm-hmm. Good morning, good morning, good morning, Atlanta. This is Dr. Carissa Hines, and you are listening live to Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa. First of all, for those of you who can see me on our Facebook stream, I am wearing my Happy New Year hat for a happy 2021. So I want to wish you all a Happy New Year. And now that I have wished my last Happy New Year, I'm going to go ahead and take this hat off. I am so happy to be back with you all after we had a 2-week hiatus. I hope you all had a wonderful and restful holiday season. And so this is our first show of 2021, and we don't have a guest today because I am going to be talking about the COVID, like a COVID update and the vaccine and my experience with taking the vaccine. So let's get started. First thing we do, we always do our shout outs. So shout out to my number one fan. Hey mom, hope you're having a great Thursday morning. Norfolk, Virginia, Virginia Beach, Virginia, Chesapeake, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Hobbs, New Mexico, Houston, Texas, Seattle, Washington, Hampton, Virginia, Woodbridge, Virginia, Columbus, Georgia, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Charlotte, North Carolina, Gadsden, Alabama, Center, Alabama, Temecula, California, Opelika, Alabama, Cedar Bluff, Alabama, Lusby, Maryland, and College Park, Georgia. Wherever you are listening from, thank you so much for tuning in. And please give us on our Facebook page, Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa, give us a shout out and let me know where you are listening, and I will shout your city out on our next show. So now you can listen live to this show on WWWE Real 1100 AM. We also stream over the internet at www.real1100.com, and you can watch the live stream on our Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa Facebook page. We are also a part of the Old Fashioned Health Network, and the live stream happens on the WWWE Real 1100 AM Facebook page. So we also have a new YouTube channel, and so the YouTube channel is youtube.com/medical minutes with Dr. Carissa. So you can find any old shows will be uploaded there going forward from today. So today's show is being recorded and will be uploaded sometime this afternoon. We also are on podcast platforms on iTunes, Google, and Captivate, Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa. You can follow us on Facebook, Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa, on Instagram at Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa, and on Twitter at Minutes Doctor. We have a new partnership to announce for 2021, Freeman Moore Medical Consultants, which is a service that provides expert disability consultation in the Atlanta community, and they can be found at www.freemanmoremedical.com, and we thank them for their partnership with our show. So now that we have gotten all of the official business out of the way, let's get into the meat of what we wanted to talk about today. So I wrote this show last week, so the numbers are a little bit off, but not by a whole lot. So as of January 3rd, and just to give you a COVID-19 update, worldwide there were 85 million cases of COVID-19 and 1.85 million deaths. And in the United States, there are 20.5 million cases that have unfortunately resulted in about 350,000 deaths. Unfortunately, cases are continuing to increase, but there is also a report of a new variant, actually a few variants. There is a South African variant, and there's also a UK variant. So the UK one was the one that was identified and reported upon first. But let's go back a little bit because this is a whole year's worth of stuff that has happened with COVID-19. So COVID-19, COVID, which stands for coronavirus disease, so CO, corona, VI, virus, D, disease, was first discovered in Wuhan, China, back in the late 2019, and then of course, spread around the world. It is what we call in the medical community a novel virus, novel meaning new, and that means that it is new to the human immune system. And so, this is a virus that no human immune system had seen before, which speaks to the virulence that it has had, and the struggle that has been, at least early on, in dealing with this. It is thought to have spread from animal to human, and very few viruses make that leap, but obviously some do. Just to give you a little fun fact that you'll need to hold on to for later in our talk, COVID-19 is a coronavirus, and what that means, it's a family of viruses that are classified because of how they look. So when you look at this virus under a microscope, it has a lot of little projections on the surface of it that looks like a crown, or corona crown. So other coronaviruses are the SARS virus that was out a few years ago, and the MERS virus that was out a few years ago. Coronavirus was first described in humans back in the 1960s. So coronavirus in and of itself is not new, but this particular virus is. And so, I explain to people that it is like having a last name. So let's say your last name is Jones, and that is your family name. Well, you aren't the only Jones, right? There will be several of you, and each of you will have a unique first name. And so that's how it works with viruses. So the coronavirus is the family name. And then when we talk about the specifics of this particular one, we're talking about the specific individual disease. So back in 2020, the virus quickly spread throughout Asia and Europe, bringing an astronomical amount of devastation in terms of illness, death, and near financial collapse as hospitals across the continent buckled under the burden of care. We can remember our colleagues in Italy and the enormous struggle that they had, where it got to the point where they were rationing ventilators and deciding, making those kinds of life-altering decisions, because there just were not enough resources to go around for the number of people who were severely ill. The first case in the United States were identified in Washington State in January of 2020. If we remember the news, the first epicenter of the outbreak in the U.S. was the Life Care Center in Kirkland, Washington, where dozens of nursing home residents were infected, and unfortunately several died. By March, the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic, meaning that it had spread all over the world. In the weeks that followed, many establishments were closed, children started distance learning at home, and there was a resultant economic downturn, which we are still experiencing, unfortunately. By May, many in the country wanted to breathe free. We were tired of being on lockdown and not being able to go and see and visit and do all the things that we do. And so many states reopened, and people began to gather. Wearing a mask became a statement of public health versus personal freedom versus political affiliation, unfortunately. And misinformation spread just as quickly as the virus, while science scrambled to make sense of what was happening. They scrambled to develop effective treatment regimens, and of course, the talk about a vaccine. So some of the first myths and misinformation about the virus, so I'm taking you all back a little bit, there was misinformation about who could and who couldn't get the virus. So there was a thing that Black people couldn't get the virus, which we now know that it's woefully untrue. And as a matter of fact, Black people and people of color were disproportionately affected and more severely affected by this virus. We were told initially that only elderly people would be severely affected. And so if you were young and healthy, you might get it, but you wouldn't die. And of course, we have, to our dismay, learned that that is not true, because one of the conundrums of this pandemic is that, and I say this as a practitioner, I've seen young, healthy, 30, 40-year-old people die. And then I've seen 70, 80-year-old people with chronic conditions, live and be discharged from the hospital. And the medical community, as of right now, can't explain why that is happening. So we can't make any rhyme or reason, to who is going to be affected and to what degree they will be affected, which makes this virus all the more dangerous. We thought that only people with chronic diseases would be severely affected, and we have now come to learn that people who have no diseases at all, no past medical history, have been severely affected and have even died. We have been told that young people would have mild disease, and we know that unfortunately there have been cases of children actually dying from COVID-19 complications. And then the one that was my favorite was, if you could hold your breath, then that means that you didn't have it. So I don't know how that came to be, but it was. As states reopened, we subsequently saw increases in new cases. So we would see these spikes, 14 days after a major event. We learned to our horror, at least to mine, again, that there was no rhyme or reason to this disease. We learned that asymptomatic carriers could spread the disease without knowing that they were even positive, that young, healthy individuals were having very severe manifestations of the disease, including death, and that elderly, chronically ill patients were surviving. The news reported case after case of the devastation caused by just one gathering, just one outing. And, you would see people on the news, their family members would be affected, and they would say, all we wanted to do was just get together. Which is, a human thing, is what we do, right? But unfortunately, this virus was not was ready for us to get together, without masks and all of this kind of stuff, and just wreak havoc. So, medicine and science put forth recommendations about social distancing, so staying at least 6 feet apart from people, wearing a mask, and about hand washing. But yet the virus has rampaged on, plundering through community after community and family after family. When we get back, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to start to talk about the vaccine. This is Dr. Carissa Hines, and you are listening to Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Dr. Carissa Hines, and you are listening to Medical Minutes with Dr. Carissa. We are talking about coronavirus 19, about the virus itself, and in this segment coming up, we're going to talk about the vaccine. So, just in our last segment, just kind of did a a brief recap of what we all went through with the virus. Um, and so I'll tell you, before I talk to you about the vaccine, I'll tell you one of the theories about why people were having such astronomical reactions to this vaccine. And so that is called a cytokine release. So cytokines are mediators of inflammation. So I'll give you an example. Anytime you, like, let's say you twist your ankle, or let's say you get bitten by a mosquito bite. That's a better example. So you get bitten by a mosquito bite, by a mosquito rather, and what happens? So you'll have localized, so right at the area of the bite, you'll have swelling, redness, and maybe even pain, right? So that's what all of that is mediated by your inflammatory response. So what cytokines are very, very powerful inflammatory mediators inside our bodies. And so what the theory is that this virus triggers a massive cytokine release. So you have this astronomical inflammation response, right? And one of the things with inflammation comes swelling. So there's a fluid that comes with this. And so whenever you had this inside the lungs, you had a tremendous amount of fluid inside your lungs. Well, I don't need to tell you, and you didn't need to go to medical school to know that water or fluid does not belong inside your lungs. That makes it difficult for you to breathe. And so when you have so much fluid inside your lungs, it makes it difficult for you to breathe, and you have to be treated for this inflammatory process, and basically then wait for the inflammatory process to subside. And so, of course, that created dangerous situations for a lot of people, particularly people that had lung issues, that were already having breathing difficulties. And so that was one of the thoughts as to why this was such a devastating disease from a pulmonary standpoint. We also learned that this virus activated clotting mechanisms within our bodies. So clotting is a normal part of how we heal. So if you cut yourself, there are cells that are responsible for clotting that come to that site of that cut, and they kind of wall off the cut so that you don't bleed to death. So that's a natural protective mechanism. However, when that mechanism goes wrong, it can have clots in places that disrupt blood supply. And so we also saw with COVID, all of the clotting mechanisms. So people were having strokes as a result of clots. People were having blood clots in their lungs. People were having heart attacks as a result of the interruption of the blood flow going to the heart muscle itself. And so, that also created dangerous situations, clinical situations for patients that would get this. And again, the scary part for me, and I'll speak for many in the medical community, was that we didn't know who, what would happen to who. So we couldn't tell you, if you're young and healthy, you don't have to worry about the blood clots, or if you're older, then you do. We couldn't make those recommendations, and to my understanding, we still can't make that kind of prediction. So the one glimmer of hope that we had was that a vaccine would be developed that would put our collective worlds back to normal, right? So many pharmaceutical companies fervently began research and development of vaccine. And many countries, including the United States, bought millions of doses of vaccine in advance without even knowing if those vaccines would work or if they were safe. So there was an order placed for millions of doses, and we just waited for the research to bear itself out, hoping that it actually would bear itself out and we would not have wasted millions of dollars in buying these vaccines. And with luck, on December 10th, 2020, Pfizer and BioNTech submitted the results of their clinical trials to the FDA in an application for EUA. So EUA stands for Emergency Use Authorization. And so what that says is that the clinical trial is not entirely completed, but they have enough data and enough of a positive result that releasing this medicine out into the market would be of more benefit than harm at this point. And usually, an emergency use authorization most commonly comes from like cancer drugs and, those things that will be kind of like last ditch efforts that, if people don't get this drug, they will die. But there's a chance that they could be saved if we, let them have this medication. And so that's one of the situations where where medication gets an EUA. And a company called Moderna followed, submitting their documentation to the FDA on December 17th, 2020. So within a week, we had EUA for 2 vaccines. The development of this vaccine is nothing short of a medical triumph. In history of vaccine development, no vaccine has been developed faster. And so, a lot of that created some unease amongst a lot of people, including me. Not that I didn't trust the science, but, just knowing the history of vaccine development, usually vaccines or medicines in general take years to develop, years of clinical trials, and then they go through the process of submitting their data to the FDA and getting approved for use. So this one was developed in less than a year, which is nothing short of amazing. So how do vaccines work just in general? So traditionally, vaccines work like this. So a weakened or inactivated virus, so it'll be a live virus, but not as potent as the actual virus, or a dead virus or an inactivated virus is injected into the body, and an immune response is triggered. After that, the immune system, because it is designed beautifully when it works as it's supposed to, remembers seeing this virus or bacteria. And if it comes in contact with that virus or bacteria again, will trigger an immune response to defeat the virus. And so, and it will do that time and time and time again because your immune system remembers. So, that's one of the things with children. When they get sick a lot, they are building those immune responses to the things that are very common amongst us. So you'll notice if your immune system is intact, meaning that you don't have any diseases of your immune system, you'll see that, if you have children, that your kids maybe get sick a lot when they go back to school or when they start school. They're always having a runny nose or a cough or cold or whatever. But then as they get older, that doesn't happen as much. And that is because that immune system has been built to recognize these foreign invader bacteria and viruses, and it takes care of it before you even get sick. So, talking about this particular vaccine, so we have to go back to biology. And I know, don't freak out on me. Don't tune me out. Don't turn the channel because there's not going to be a quiz at the end of this, right? So just a little bit to talk about what makes us us, right? So we talk about these vaccines are RNA vaccines. And so what does that mean? So we'll go back first to DNA. So DNA is the molecule that carries genetic instructions for the development, functioning, growth, and reproduction of all organisms, right? So it is our blueprint, right? It is unique to individuals, with the exception of the case of identical twins. So they have, because they are from the same egg and same sperm split, they have identical DNA with very little variation. So remember, DNA is the blueprint, right? So then we have RNA, which converts that genetic material in DNA and uses that info to build proteins. So proteins are the building blocks of basically everything that we are, right? So afterwards, in another part of the cell, these proteins are put together in very specific and specialized ways to build everything that our bodies are made of. So there is a code, if you will, or a blueprint, if you will, that determines what color eyes you will have, what color your skin will be, what color your hair will be, if you will be a boy, if you will be a girl. And all of those things are put together to create a human, right? So that's really, really fascinating. So the RNA is like the construction team, right? So if you're building something, building a building, building a house. So you'll have the blueprint, which tells you where everything should go and how everything should be. But then you've got to have somebody to build off of those instructions. So that's DNA is the instruction and RNA is the builder. Okay. So that's it in a nutshell. So you had a little biology lesson. Nobody freaked out. It was easy. I hope that was simple, right? Because that's what I want. I don't want to confuse anyone. So the COVID-19 vaccine. The vaccine is an mRNA or a messenger RNA. So that one's kind of like a postman, right? So it's delivering these messages to other types of RNA, which will then go forth in the protein synthesis parts of our metabolism and will build. So it carries the instruction for our cells to make a piece of the spike protein. So remember back when I told you all about what coronavirus looks like under the microscope? Remember I talked to you about the corona, the crown that the virus wears, for lack of a better way of putting it. So those spikes are called, those little projections are called spike proteins. Okay, and so they're found on the surface of the corona-19 virus. So the spike protein, the mRNA vaccine has instructions of how to create this spike protein. And then from there, our bodies will take those instructions and produce that spike protein on some cells. Our bodies will then, our immune systems will then say, that's not supposed to be there. So I'm going to attack that. I'm going to recognize it as an invader. It's not supposed to be in my body, and I'm going to attack and defeat it. And so that is the basis of this being an RNA vaccine and how it works, right? So it is only giving us a part of the virus, so not the virus as a whole, right? And it also mimics what would naturally happen if we were exposed to the actual virus. So the virus comes in, our immune system recognizes the virus in whole, and so in recognizing it in whole, it can recognize any part of the virus as well, and then mounts the response. So now, of course, with the vaccine, you don't want to have you don't want to give enough of a virus that causes severe disease, right? You don't want to do that, but you just want to give just enough or show just enough of it where you can have an adequate immune response to protect the body, to protect us from the virus. So getting into, so I have a couple of questions here that people sent, and I thank you all so much for, I put out on Facebook, who had questions about the vaccine. And so, I was hoping that we would have time to get into that. And so we'll do that, and then we'll get into the actual data about these two studies. So a few questions. So is the vaccine made of full virus particles. No, only the spike protein, only the crown part is reproduced, not the full virus. So in the vaccine, you are not getting coronavirus. Okay. Does the virus affect our DNA? So no. So as I explained to you all before, and this is why I took the time to do that, RNA in biology and in this vaccine does not enter the place where DNA is stored. So it cannot become a part of our genetic code. Okay. Now, there are viruses that do that, and they are called reverse transcriptase viruses. And the most common one, or most commonly known one, is HIV. So HIV can go backwards, but most other viruses cannot. And coronavirus is one of the ones that cannot. So it cannot go from RNA to DNA. It only goes forward. So our genetic code is not at all altered by receiving this vaccine. How is this vaccine better, or how is any vaccine better? There is little risk of causing illness because the fully formed virus is not administered. So, of course, we do watch for any signs of any types of infection. And we'll talk in another couple of questions. I think somebody asked me about getting sick after they get the vaccine. And I'll explain to you how that happens in just a minute. So Michael in Atlanta has asked, how long is the vaccine effective? And unfortunately, Michael, we don't know that as of yet, because as I mentioned, these vaccines were released under an EUA. So the studies are still ongoing. Both Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech are in phase 3 of their clinical trials. And so they are continuing on with their data gathering and reporting. Now, several people asked me this question. So Frank from Chesapeake, Cassandra from Richmond, and Georgia from Gadsden asked in various ways, does the vaccine really keep me safe, or do I still need to wear a mask? And the simple question is yes and yes. That's the simple answer. So immunity from a vaccine is not immediate. Okay, so getting to the point that I was making earlier about people getting the vaccine and then saying that they got sick and they think that they got sick from the vaccine, and that's not how it works. So typically you get a vaccine, it takes a couple of weeks in order for you to have a full immune response. So during that time, most of what I read said about 1 week to 3 weeks. So let's just say 3 weeks, right? So during that 3 weeks, you still can get the get the virus, and you still can get sick because your body hasn't had enough time to mount a full immune response to protect you. So because of that, you still need to wear your mask. But once your immune system is fully activated, you will have the protection of the vaccine. And that is true of any vaccine. So, a lot of people say, oh, I got the flu vaccine and then I got the flu. No, the flu vaccine didn't cause the flu. But what happened is while your body was trying to get its immune response together, you got exposed and got sick. Okay, so that's how that works. So you got to give your body a good 3 weeks to get the immune system fully activated. So during that time, it is still possible to contract the disease. So you definitely want to wear your mask. Another point about wearing your mask, even after you get both doses of the vaccine, is we don't know yet if people can still transmit the vaccine, even though they themselves are protected by the vaccine. We don't know if they can still be what we call asymptomatic carriers and transmit the virus to other people. So until we answer that question, you definitely still, we still are making the recommendation about wearing your mask and social distancing and, good hand washing. Crystal in Atlanta has asked, how long does COVID live on surfaces? So, from what we know, COVID lives for hours to up to days, depending upon the surface, the temperature that that surface is in, and its exposure to sunlight. Because some viruses, and it appears that coronavirus, will degrade in direct sunlight. Nicolette in Atlanta has asked, where are people getting exposed? So, COVID is spread through respiratory droplets. So, breathing, talking, coughing, sneezing, all of those are vectors for spreading these respiratory droplets that may contain Corona 19. So, any close proximity to an infected person or persons in any setting can result in spread of the virus. Of course, what the recommendation is, of course, to avoid large gatherings of more than 10 people, which 10, that's not really a large gathering, but that's what they're saying to decrease the risk. Now, I am saying don't gather at all if you can at all help it. And if you do gather, everybody should wear their mask at this point, because of course we haven't vaccinated everyone, and we're going to talk about that too. Lima in Rockville, Maryland says, does the severity of the disease relate to antibody levels? So the antibody is the immune system's response. So that's what gets sent. They're like soldiers. So that's what gets sent to the front lines to battle this virus, okay? And so there's a study that was published back in November in Japan that does suggest that there is a pattern of what we call priming. So someone was exposed to a different type of coronavirus, and that prompted an antibody response. And then they got exposed to COVID-19 virus, and that full on activated the immune system and that antibody response. And so what they are saying is that people who can't mount that much of an antibody response may see, more severe disease, or in the opposite, more mild disease. But that is also a study that is ongoing, and so we'll wait to see. I'm interested to know what the results of that study will be once they are completely finished, because that's a very interesting theory. Antibodies in general can last for several months, but as I said earlier, it takes about 1 to 3 weeks for a full antibody response to happen inside the body. So, because of that, I talked earlier about the different types of testing, right? So we have the rapid test, which is an antibody test, and then we have the regular test that takes 3 or 4 days, which is an antigen test. So the first one, the antigen test, is the easier one to explain. So the antigen test tests for the presence of the virus. So if it is negative, assuming that the test has been administered correctly, if it is negative, you don't have the virus. With the rapid test, however, you can have false negatives, because if you are within that 3 weeks and have been exposed, you have not mounted an antibody response that would give you a positive test, but you still have the virus. So that's how you can have those false positives. So the rapid test is not as reliable because, of course, unless you can pinpoint exactly when you were exposed, we can't tell when you should have mounted an antibody response, right? So those are a few questions, and I have a lot more questions, and I'm going to answer those a little bit later. But in the time that we have left, I wanted to get to the actual vaccines. So there are 2 vaccines currently on the market. One made by the collaboration of Pfizer and BioNTech, and the second one by Moderna. And so, we've been following my conversations about COVID and the vaccine. I repeatedly said that I was hesitant to get it, and that I would wait on the data. And so, A lot of people are skeptical about vaccines, for good reason, right? So there is, unfortunately, a mistrust of the medical community, and that is based upon historical atrocities, I'll call it that. Most notable, or what comes to people's mind a lot, is the Tuskegee experiment. And so, for those that don't know, the Tuskegee experiment was one about syphilis, and about the what they wanted to study was what we call the late effects of syphilis. So, syphilis can be, the first things that you see on the skin, but as the disease is allowed to prolong itself, it can have devastating effects on the body, particularly on the brain. And so, that was the research question, like, what is the long-term effect of syphilis? And unfortunately, with this experiment, the young men who were included in this were not told that this is what they would be participating in. And so many of them did not receive treatment. And so that just violates, so many tenets of medicine, particularly ethics, because anytime you engage someone in an experiment, or someone comes to you, they have a right to know what exactly you're going to do to them. Because and to be given the choice, right? So, because a lot of them, I'm sure, I don't know anybody that would say, yes, I have syphilis, but no, don't give me the medicine, right? No one would do that. And then, of course, there is the study of Henrietta Lacks, where her genes were taken, and she is a medical marvel and a medical hero. And I encourage you to look up her story. But basically, her cells were taken and were used to develop all kinds of things, medicines and other technologies. And those cells were used without her permission, without her family's permission. Again, that's just wrong. Can't do that. Then, of course, there is the involvement of politics and money in this particular venture, right, with getting the vaccine. And so, we all know about this current administration, and how they were really, really pushing to have a vaccine done before Election Day, and before this day, and before that day, and all of this other stuff. And we're really applying pressure. And my concern was that there would be those who would bow to that pressure and do things that were perhaps not as thorough as they should have been done. And so, I'm happy to report that my fear of that was unfounded. And then, of course, there is the belief that vaccines just don't work. There is a segment of society that is anti-vaccine, right? So, those are reasons for people to be skeptical. And then, of course, as I talked about, the misinformation and so on and so forth. So, like I said, for me, I was cautious about that, more so about the external involvement of politics in medicine, which I just didn't think it had any place for it. So, and that was based upon something that was legit, right? Because we all remember the drug hydroxychloroquine, or the brand name is Plaquenil, and how everybody was recommending, not everybody, y'all know who it was recommending that we take Plaquenil, right? Well, Plaquenil is a very, very excellent drug, but it also has a very, very dangerous side effect of a cardiac arrhythmia that can cause death. So you can't just go out just giving that willy-nilly to just anybody, right? You have to be very, very cautious. And as a matter of fact, it is one of those drugs that only a few types of doctors can actually prescribe. So, so there was that, and that just kind of made me skeptical. But I'm happy to report that after reviewing the briefing documentation that was submitted to the FDA by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, that I was very, very pleased and encouraged with the results. And I had my first dose of the vaccine on December 28th, and I have my second dose coming up on January 18th. And so far, I have not had any problems, no symptoms. Of course, I had some soreness, because it is what we call an intramuscular injection. So they inject it into the muscle in your shoulder, into your deltoid. And so that hurt for a couple of days. Not untypical, not atypical of any other type of shot that you would get in that fashion. And so, so it hurt for a couple days, and then after that, I was back to, back to 100% Carissa. And going forward, I've had no problems. And I also am participating in the VSafe vaccine monitoring. So every day, the FDA sends me a little text asking me to go on to their system and tell them how I'm feeling. So I'm participating in that way. So real quick, let's get to the data. So, I'm almost out of time, but like I said, I am going to do a different segment because there were some other questions and I want to make sure that I answer all of them. But really quickly, let's talk about the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which is the one that I got. So it is 2 doses set to be distributed 21 days or 3 weeks apart. It is recommended for ages 16 and older, although they did study children ages 12 to 15, but they didn't have enough children in the study to make a conclusive recommendation for that age group. So, that is ongoing as well. So that's why they have not made any recommendations for children under the age of 16. The study is currently in a phase 3 trial. So the first phase is the not experimental, but it is the actual development of the vaccine. And then they do animal trials. And then they do small groups of human trials. And then when you get to phase 3, you're talking about larger numbers, so like tens of thousands of people. So this study was designed very, very well, I'll tell you. So it was what we call a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. So what does that mean? Randomized means that if you take a group of people, you split them into 2, you don't know who's going to get what